Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ketty Loeb, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Spring 2023 Seminar Series, which is co-hosted by the UH Manoa's Institute for Sustainability and the Climate Resilience Collective, or Collaborative. The aim of this series is to build bridges between academic researchers, sustainability practitioners, and policymakers, and to ensure that policies and practices are informed by the most up-to-date research. This spring, the seminar will focus on sea level rise research and adaptation strategies. Please join us on Wednesdays between now and April 26th, either in person here at the UH Manoa Key Kendall Hall or via Zoom. I would like to note that the presentations are conducted both live in person and on Zoom, and that this presentation will be recorded at the request of the speakers. Please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. Please also put your speakers on mute to preserve the sound quality, and we can ask questions at the end. You're welcome to write them in the chat and or ask them in person at the end. So today we are very honored to welcome two colleagues from across the Pacific who are going to present on the intersections of sea level rise, brownfields, and environmental justice with case studies from the San Francisco Bay Area. We think the first speaker is going to be Ann Carroll, who's having some technical issue on now. Okay, great. The first speaker will be Ann Carroll, who is a public health lead in the EPA's Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization. And the second speaker will be Ignacio Dayrit, who's lead program consultant for the Center of Creative Land Recycling, where he coordinates a technical assistance program to states, cities, and tribes. And he also teaches at Golden Gate University. Please join me in welcoming Ann and Ignacio. Ann, you're welcome to share your screen and begin your presentation.
I am looking forward to it, and I'm sorry I'm not saying hello to all of you in person. I guess that's just how things go these days, right? Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm here in representation of my colleague, Chicago, not Chicago, our San Francisco office, who are not able to be there. Not in speaker.
Oh, there you go. That'll do.
Alrighty.
There, that's it. Now we're up and running.
Now we're up and running. Anyway, thanks again. I will just forge ahead and look forward to your questions at the end, because this isn't really all about me. It's about you guys asking questions and learning more about what we're trying to do, and you also helping the communities where you're working to address some of these issues. As you might imagine, brownfields are those historical areas that have been developed along coastal areas. So, you know, that's where we put industry, that's where we put manufacturing, that's where the natural resources were that allowed, you know, businesses to locate there. And so it is those areas now that we know to be so vulnerable. So along the coastal areas, waterways, manufacturing and industry was often near the natural resources. Transportation corridors often have to be near a water body or in a flat land area. We also have recognized that the communities that have been suffering from disinvestment, which are often brownfields communities, are also going to be more vulnerable and more sensitive to some of the impacts of climate change. So not only how are we engaging them in the work that we're doing on brownfields, but also how are we incorporating and factoring the resilience needs, the adaptation and mitigation needs as part of our brownfields project and as part of our broader community conversations. And so recognizing the past disinvestment, that also means we have to think about the investment for the new infrastructure that's going to build that resilience. How are we engaging the communities? How are we providing technical assistance and resources? And how are we countering their climate vulnerabilities in that process? And so that's what Ignacio and I will be talking about today. So a brownfield definition by law is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or a potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, and contaminant. It's an awkward definition, but that's what was in the law. And the real point is that not only are they not all contaminated sites, sometimes it's the potential presence, and just that fear of a contaminated site is what stops it from moving forward. And so our funding, our grants, and our technical assistance are not only to help people identify if there is a hazard, but also if there isn't a hazard, because that's a really comforting thing. And that might be a really important information for a community that wants to build their own resilience as part of what they're doing. And so this is just an example of an East Millinocket, Maine mill, which, not surprisingly, power mills, textile mills were often along waterways, as those were the engines for their operations. And so in addition to all the work that we're doing on individual sites, really to support community-driven revitalization, how are we thoughtfully considering how that site links with housing or transportation infrastructure, roadways, or those main thoroughfares, the power and utility connections, as well as communication, broadband, other kinds of more essential services? And are we bringing resilience to both those brownfield connections, but also those climate connections? Because those are also going to be the areas that are going to be vulnerable and will need some attention. As we know, sea level rise, wildfires, drought, urban heat are only some of the climate impacts we're all struggling with. We know that sea level rise brings more frequent flooding, more expansive flooding, increased shoreline erosion and subsidence in some cases, as well as contamination of groundwater. And in the context of a brownfield, that there's an additional layer of complication, which is, okay, and that's also going to mobilize some contaminants that might change the natural systems that actually degrade certain contaminants. And so we have to factor that into our cleanup activities. It might impede stormwater, drainage, damage critical infrastructure, and of course, structures. And so again, those are things that we need to incorporate into our planning activity. I'm sure many of you are more expert on sea level rise modeling and sustainability for the Hawaii Islands than I am, but this was the closest I could find, really just to show, one, the average sea level change, and also, as you'll see, there seems to be on the right map a little bit of a data gap in that there isn't, concrete good information that's talking about what the sea change is going to be in the islands. So again, maybe that's a data gap. Maybe there's just less of a risk in that particular area. And that's an older map. Is that still true today? So we know, and I'm in the mid-Atlantic region, so we know that sea level rise will vary due to regional factors, the land movement, ocean dynamics, as well as, the subsidence and of course, some of these things are happening faster than was originally anticipated. So unfortunately, there hasn't been the changes in greenhouse gas emissions we'd hoped would have happened by now, and the warming and the increased melting will further add to the complications of thinking about both regional and global sea level rise and the impacts in our communities. Again, different visuals, but again, in a contaminated site context, how are we thinking about the fact that that increased not only water, but the mix of the salt water with the fresh water, and what is that going to do? Because that's not only changing the surface conditions, but it's changing the subsurface conditions and often the soil chemistry that might also affect contaminants and their mobilization. And of course, the fundamental concern is, how are we being exposed in populations, in communities? How are we countering that exposure? How are we protecting those communities? And how are we building their capacity to make decisions that can protect them, even as we're trying to do that in our site work? We've recently developed some visualization materials, and that's one of the things you see on the left. You'll see those again, but it's really trying to make that kind of climate impact connection to the work that we're doing in different areas around the country. But so urban heat is certainly an issue, drought conditions and wildfires. and of course, the continued impact on the population. And so what I want to show a little bit today is a project that happened in 2015. So we had an area that we had done, it had multiple brownfields. It was an industrial area in Philadelphia, and we worked with the city, our contractors, and the EPA headquarters and regional office. Essentially, there was a roadway expansion that was planned along and in brownfields and contaminated sites. Those older industrial sites were also near a waterway. And so it was the combination of the roadway expansion, the contaminated sites, and a waterway that really started this project. And so they were historically older sites. There had been an area-wide plan to look at this watershed and this area, and then, the discovery of the brownfield sites as an area to catalyze the redevelopment and cleanup in the area, but also had to think about these kind of realities of the space. And the other kind of complicating factor is this area next to the waterway was also near, as you can see, the spaghetti turns, an on-ramp to an important arterial road, which then brought new players and considerations into the planning. So in the course of that project, we also discovered that looking at just the 100-year sea level rise using Army Corps of Engineers and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration tools, and you see the link, we actually did a training webinar on those tools for this. One, we discovered that there's some real issues with what was being proposed for the reuse of the site based on the potential flooding. And two, we needed to think about maybe this really needed to be turned into green space that would provide another buffer to the community rather than, some of them were planned and structured redevelopment. And so this was really the not only the current conditions, but also projections at different levels of risk. And of course, when you're talking about a big transportation infrastructure project, they might tolerate a different risk than another kinds of site reuse. And so again, here's the 100-year inundation with some additional information and some modeling for future periods of time. And as you can see, the outline of the sites suggests that there's going to be some substantial flooding in the frontage of the area, and they're now thinking more about turning these into parks and kind of water, more blue-green connection rather than a fixed redevelopment. But we also have to think about the coastal erosion, the changes in groundwater, and I know Ignacio is going to talk about that a little bit more, because we're often thinking about, the surface flooding, and we're forgetting that groundwater is going to be coming up, which is particularly important for contaminated sites. And so thinking both about surface safety and then also what are we doing to protect undersites and maintaining hydraulic control. How are we thinking about the extent and frequency of the saturation and impacts on infrastructure and sites? And then how are we thinking about that in terms of more protective design and more protective site areas? We're going to have to be depaving some areas if we're going to allow some extreme weather event water to be infiltrating. And so again, the environmental hazards and the cleanup costs that are underutilized lands are going to be increasing under future climate conditions. The severity and the frequency is undetermined, but it's something that we are preparing for and thinking about as we triage sites with states, tribes, and communities. And the environmental justice concerns both in the conversation about the sites, in the prioritizing of the sites for attention, and in building the community capacity to engage on these issues and in a way that's going to protect their community. So the key risk and message for all of us is we have to think about the climate before we really get into the site information, the prioritization, the cleanup level determination, because you clean a site for a particular reuse. And so you want to make sure that that reuse is going to be protective into the future and that we are thinking about the climate in that planning. A different way of saying what I've already said, but really the point is we have to do it earlier, because the earlier you do it, the better the information that you're going to have and the easier it is going to be to make the decisions. The longer you delay, the more the costs are increasing, and you're also reducing your own flexibility to change your project and factor in new information. So these are some materials we've put together in the past. And I encourage you, if you're interested in the brownfield and sea level rise or resilience nexus, we'd love to have your interest and enthusiasm and research in that area. So the Climate Smart Brownfields manuals on our webpage under our Land Revitalization Toolkit. It was updated in 2021. The brownfield revitalization in climate vulnerable areas is a little bit older, and we're working on updating that in the coming year. And then this checklist is really to help those who are, seeking grants to think through what they're doing. I mentioned the climate visuals. As you probably wouldn't be aware of this, but in other parts of the country, it's a dirty word to talk about the climate. On the other hand, if we can actually make that kind of visual connection without using the words, maybe that's the way to start engaging certain communities in certain vulnerable areas. So this is really just a way to talk about urban heat. We're also going to have some different visualizations for different regions of the country. And it's really just introducing, we have to depave, we have to increase shade, we have to have more reflective surfaces. There's solar panels, there's green roofs, there's a host of things. After the cleanup of the site, we can be, engaging communities on those kinds of retrofits. And a common brownfield is actually the abandoned gas station. And so this is just a point of showing, the built environment connections and ways that we can better manage stormwater. So the green infrastructure, as well as the curb cuts and pervious pavements. And then, of course, more sea level rise oriented examples. So the site on the left could be a contaminated site, as well as the one to the right of it. And both of those are obviously going to be vulnerable as there's both storm surges and increased levels. And so how are we thinking about, as we clean this up, how are we turning it into an asset for the community, making sure the site is protective, but also bringing something to a community that might need a park or some other safe waterways and some living shoreline. So again, some of the things I mentioned, our Superfund program office also has a range of climate materials. And then these are some other EPA resources. And because we have our National Brownfields Training Conference in Detroit, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that for any of you who want to join us and the 2,000-ish or more practitioners around the country to talk brownfields and climate resilience. So if you have any questions, and that's how you can catch me, Carol, carroll.ann@epa.gov. And because I am your public servant, I look forward to hearing from you if I can help.
Thank you so much, Anne. I think we'll shift directly to Ignacio now and hold questions for after his talk.
And I'll go off video so I don't distract anybody. But as we are you ready, Ignacio?
He's up.
Okay. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's nice to see some familiar faces or familiar names on the attendee list. Like Anne, I regret I can't be with you there today. And one thing that Kerry didn't mention, that Anne and I were recruited to this last Friday, so we kind of scrambled to put
Thank you.
something together for you, and I hope it meets your requirements. And then one thing though, Anne has a PhD. I don't. Though I teach, I'm much more a practitioner because of my 30 plus years of experience, and I have before the screen before you. You have really we talked about brownfields, but when you're talking about sea level rise, a lot of the Superfund sites in the country are actually on waterways, and on the left you have the Bayview Hunters Point. That's a Hunters Point shipyard, which is currently under redevelopment. Most of the property has already been transferred to the city of San Francisco, and those apartments and those condos actually are built. And that's the San Francisco skyline behind those buildings. On the right, some of you might be familiar with Kaka'ako. And that was a brownfield site itself that received a grant uh, received by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. That site used to have incinerators, at least a couple of them, and it's also undergone some redevelopment. And so these sites, uh, did have contamination. They probably still have residual levels of contamination. In fact, there probably is. And that's the key problem with sea level rise and contaminated sites along coastal areas. And just before I go further, a bit about CClear. We are a nonprofit, and we are a technical assistance provider. We help states in region EPA regions 9 and 10, which includes Hawaii, uh, on issues related to brownfields. So we provide technical assistance, one-on-one workshops. We've had a couple of many workshops actually and conferences in Honolulu and the islands. And there are technical assistance providers around the country. And we're all there to assist in these types of issues. But we work just on brownfields, really. When it comes to Superfund, which is a different office within EPA, it's a bit different. And when you're dealing with huge bureaucracies, they have their division, their different departments and divisions. So you might be dealing with brownfields, but there are other offices within EPA that work on contaminated sites that you may not be aware of. And so those are some of the things I'll be talking about today. Now, I mentioned Bayview, the Hunters Point shipyard. This is part of that ship. This is just outside the shipyard, and you can probably see those condos out in the distance in the picture. This was also subject of an EPA grant, one of those grants that Anne mentioned, which was that involved area-wide planning. And they want to take, and they're actually in the process of turning this into a park. What you may see is a park there, but and this project started 10, 15 years ago because actually I helped write the grant that received this. And over time, the city and nonprofits have received a series of grants and technical assistance to get to this point. This site is actually getting cleaned up right now. And something unique to this site on brownfields, to a brownfield project, but not really to coastal sites, is there is also contaminated sediment in this area. And so these are kind of complications that you have to navigate the system to figure out where to get the assistance, to get to the stage where you're actually cleaning up a site. This site, it's also received foundation grant funding. And so there are there's lots of leveraging going on. But the key, again, to a lot of these projects is that you have to start early, and the funding that you get from the EPA and other federal agencies typically are only the beginning, and you have to leverage that with a whole lot of other funding from other sources. Shifting to the Bay Area, so those red dots, I'll back up. Those red areas, they identify the priority development areas where our metro, our Council of Governments, has basically identify those areas as the key growth areas where to concentrate growth in the Bay Area. So San Francisco, as you can see, is over here, Berkeley, and San Jose down south here. Now, those dots are all known or existing sites that have undergone environmental cleanup and regulation. As you can see, they track very closely. They track very closely with where the growth is targeted, and clicking through, that's where 6-foot sea level rise is expected. And so you can see that, again, a lot of these sites which are on the bay margin are also areas where there will be contamination found and contamination left in place. Some of these are not so contaminated, and some of them are very contaminated. And so for each site, there are going to be these challenges related with cleanup on top of the sea level rise that will happen. And to echo what Anne said about sea level rise and climate change, it's low income communities that will be affected the most because they all are already subject to adverse health conditions, and then they are located, many of their neighborhoods are adjacent to these brownfield sites and these contaminated sites. And even if there's natural disasters, they are least likely to be able to recover. They're the ones that have to be helped the most. Those with more affluent might suffer higher economic damage, but as a percentage of income, lower income communities get wiped out. They basically get left with nothing. And so that's why anything we do with brownfields and response to climate change will benefit low-income communities and peoples of color the most. And again, Ange had shown you some of these impacts of sea level rise on communities and as well as on brownfields. Once the sea level rises, the groundwater rises, and salt water will intrude upon on the contamination, and it changes a lot of things when you're talking about cleanup. And I'm going to go through that a bit later on. Again, economic losses. These are just as of last year, we were. That's up to September. We were already very close to the 2020 impact.
We'll give it a second. Hopefully Ignacio can reconnect and.
Okay. So what he was saying was that, as you can see, 2020 is a record year in terms of losses. And so this slide was taken as of, his slide just.
Please, you go ahead and keep talking, Anne.
Anyway, the bottom line being, at September, we were already approaching the record of 2020. And so again, that's an issue for all of us in the sense that, these are costs, to individuals, but it's also the challenge of, are we going to have access to food? Are we going to have, our transportation or infrastructure systems working? And I think that's, if COVID hadn't already taught us about the unintended consequences of certain things, like, there's an agricultural market that only serves restaurants, and it's different than the agricultural market that serves consumers. And if one is prepared and the other isn't, there are problems with the missupply, there's problems with food waste, there's problems with systems not being seamless. Has anyone has EPA or anyone else mapped where these vulnerable communities are? There's actually our Office of, and thank you for that question, and I'm sorry if I've missed other ones, so please, ask me. It's called EJ Screen, is the environmental justice screen that our Office of Environmental Justice and External Community and Office of Environmental Justice was its name until recently. And now it is OEJO External Justice. So OEJ. Yeah, anyway. And so I would say go to the Environmental Justice Screen or EJ Screen. There's also a new one that's actually a climate risk. And so it's called CJES. So it's trying to be climate justice and environmental justice, a kind of a combined map. The challenge for those of you who are researchers and data people, of course, is there's indices used. And so how have those indexes been compiled? Are they reflective of all communities, or was that, kind of something done at a national level that it might, happen very differently at a local level? So I think it's always valuable to ground truth locally what some kind of a national indicator system or indices say. So those are two that I'm aware of. I know that many of the other federal family have different kind of mapping and as it relates to their statutory program and activities, they're trying to think about social vulnerability index, for example, from the CDC. And I know NOAA has had their storm surge indicator and some other tools that have been, really very user friendly for people who are not doing, storm surge modeling, and are not experts in that. And my background is more in public health, and where public health and environmental justice. There he is.
Sorry, I'm going to take my video off because it might be causing my instability here. Let's see. Sorry about that. So going back to my last slide, which if I can find it.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Anne, for answering some questions in the interim.
Okay. People can't see my slides yet, right?
Not yet.
Okay, share screen. All right, now
There
you
we
can.
are.
Sorry, so was this a last slide? Last slide people saw?
The last slide was the
Or do I have to back up?
No,
economic.
it was the hazards.
Okay.
But I
Let
talked
me
everybody
back.
through 2020. So
All right. So those are the costs. Did you see this slide?
No.
no.
Okay. How about this slide? It doesn't matter. These last two slides just basically show that if you plan ahead, you save a lot of money. But if you're going to be using a lot of these, if you're going to be planning for these sites, you have to realize that if you are going to count on the market, the public sector to participate, they're going to need a whole lot of they're going to have a lot of uncertainty, and unfortunately, a lot of these sites have too much uncertainty, and because their regulatory costs, their funding costs, their liability costs, so that it ends up that local government, state government, and federal government have to come and help at least jumpstart things. And if the problem proves to be too much, even almost take over a project. And that's exactly what Superfund sites are about, where in many of these sites, it's just too dirty that the responsible party can't clean up. And the United States government pledges to clean it up, subject to fund availability, which could take a lot of time. And here's just a short chart of how this process works. You have to identify sites, you have to plan with the community, which sites to do. If sites are contaminated, you have to do some site investigation. And of course, if these are coastal, and I'm assuming these are all coastals we're discussing now, is that remediation can happen with adaptation, or the adaptation can happen down the road. So and since we haven't done so many of these projects, it's really an open question when the adaptation actually happens. But you have to figure out who your stakeholders are, what the process would be, and the more government agencies that are involved, the more process is involved. And if you're going to count on the private sector to participate, they have to deal with the market, and they have to figure out what makes sense, how can they recover costs. The government will have to figure out, if there will be taxes generated, what taxes can be generated and can be leveraged toward the solution. And so these take decades. Here's another chart of that same process and where you might be able to get money from. The Environmental Protection Agency in your own state environmental office, Hawaii Department of Health, might be able to provide some funds for identification, investigation, and remediation. But in the end, there are other funds that you will have to seek. And that depends so much on the project. Projects such as parks will need parks funding, but if a park serves as a as an adaptation. For instance, if it's green infrastructure that serves sort of like a public works project, you can look to certain other funds to help in that solution. But again, early on, work with your state health agency and the EPA and maybe a couple of other federal agencies. But in the end, you should actually be looking at the other potential fund sources to see how your project can actually fit based on the needs and of your community. There's a chat here. I just want to be sure. Okay. Um, and now here's a chart that basically shows this is what's called the conceptual site model. And there are different versions of this chart based on the site conditions. But in here, you see that there might be a spill from an underground storage tank that affects the soil and groundwater. There's always groundwater and the water table represented there. And then you have receptors. You have people. You have ecology. You got birds, fish, people, and the occupants of that site. So that's kind of the lay of the land, as it were. Now, when you're talking about the coastal brownfield, it gets much more complicated. Your sea level rises, your plume might go up, and if you're near a waterway, it can get into the water. And so you have already a lot of more concerns here. And then did you see that bubbling up of, if the groundwater goes up, that you can actually have groundwater bubble up and bring contamination with it, and you might have structures on the ground that might float up because it's pushed up by the groundwater, and you may have, for instance, pipes. Now, pipes, most of them leak, and those that are exposed to volatile compounds can bring that contamination into indoor spaces. Now, this is just, kind of an intro to Coastal Brownfields 101. There are so many more other concerns here because even the remediation process, the way to remediate these sites gets extra complicated as well. Now, those contamination, the way these sites are remediated. You remediate the soil, you remediate the groundwater, and you remediate the soil vapor. And those are the tools that are normally used. Excavation is just digging out the soil. In situ is treating the soil with some chemicals or feeding bacteria that eats contamination, or stabilizing it, or heating it up to burn the contaminant. Kind of, I wouldn't say burn, but volatilize it and make it burn off, basically. Or you could treat it on site, but you dig it out first, treat it on site, and you put it back in because, and as an island nation, this is you don't want really digging up a lot of contaminated soil because you don't have very many places to bring that soil. You have to barge them off the island. But that's why in situ or ex situ are probably looked more seriously in island or places where there are no landfills. And then you can never clean up a site completely to pristine levels. And so you contain and manage a safe amount that is calculated with risk assessments. You leave them on site. You might cap it. You might there are caps that cap the top of a site, or they put walls around the contamination. So these are called institutional engineering and institutional controls. An institutional control would basically tell the future users of this site is that don't dig here, or don't use this for residential. And those in themselves have issues, but those are the solutions. For groundwater, it can be pumped and treated, or it can be, you can kind of push and pull them to go in different directions, and other ways to remove the contamination from the groundwater. And again, there are some ways of doing in situ remediation on groundwater. And for soil vapor, these are for constituents that are bound to the soil or groundwater that volatilize, and when they vaporize are very dangerous to humans. So those are the typical. We could we can have a 3-day, 4-day conference just on this one slide. This is kind of your Cliff Notes version. But what happens here is once the groundwater goes up, gets shallower, and if it's salt water, it completely changes what you can do for bioremediation. It changes what you can do for the other technologies. It's more difficult to pump and treat and or to excavate. You excavate wet soil, that's very, very heavy and very expensive. So again, all those solutions just get so much more complicated in the coastal side. So these will change with sea level rise. Now in California, this came out literally. As I was finalizing my PowerPoint, this came up on my email. This guidance is new in California. I'm assuming some other states have done this as well. Draft sea level rise guidance for contaminated sites. Now, where they have a database, a map database, which includes the sites that they regulate and the projected sea level rise. And the goal here is to keep reassessing and reassessing how a solution on a site will stand the test of time. The challenge here is that the sea level rise projections are pretty uncertain. We're told that by 2100 in the Bay Area, the waters could rise up to 9 feet, but they won't really know until 2030. So we have 7 years of uncertainty there. And even that step one, where identify the nearest tide gauge, well, so that tide gauge will change over time. So you're essentially saying by this circular process, you're having to completely reassess the solutions on the site every time you check the tide gauge. So that's a whole lot of uncertainty. And bringing it back to the market perspective, many of these brownfield sites have a negative real estate value, which kind of increases over time the more work you do on it. Now, a typical green field site, it's clean, you don't have to deal with contamination. You start out positive. And for instance, the same project on the same type of site, you have that kind of profit gap there. And of course, people will go to a greenfield because there's no risk or there's less risk. Now, brownfields grants and incentives try to narrow that gap so that those brownfields grants can help with site identification, acquisition, and remediation. And additional incentives like tax credits or density bonuses can narrow the gap between a market rate project, a greenfield site versus a brownfield site. But when you're saying you won't be able to plan really for sure until 2030 and beyond, you have a whole lot of uncertainty there because we don't really know where climate change is going. Even the experts are telling us we won't know until 2030. So that's a big problem when you're counting on some kind of solution and counting on the market to come to the rescue for some of these projects. Now, so how do we fund some of this early EPA money, the EPA assistance? Well, there's a Brownfields program. They have all these grant programs, and I'm not going to go into this. There are webinars for this. There are recordings, so you can go to the old recordings or join the new recordings that will be coming up. They come in every 2 or 3 months. So there are recordings or there will be webinars coming up. But the key here is that there is money, early money. EPA Brownfields team is one of the friendliest teams on the planet as far as the regulators. So uh, reach out to them. And they also have an environmental justice that have their own set of funds. And the EPA has other offices as well. So, and these teams don't necessarily converse with each other regularly. And so you almost have to reach out to them separately. There are other federal programs that can help depending on your reuse. The Economic Development Administration, they work on public works projects. If you're working on a port, you're working on industry and commerce, they can help as long as your project aligns with their priorities. HUD also works that way. HUD has been silent the last couple of years. They're probably designing their programs, but if you have housing affected by sea level rise, well, they have funding just for that. So HUD is another program to watch. And again, these funds are come and go. Every 2 to 4 years, these change with the makeup of Congress and the White House. That's just the way it is. So you have to keep tabs on that. The Department of Energy, you can actually use, renewable energy for some remediation projects, through some thermal projects or using electricity generated from solar. And so the DOE can help with those types. Or if you're just doing climate change and changing the makeup of your energy, your sources of energy, the DOE they have lots of funds right now. DOT, if you're working on highways or transit that will be affected by climate change, again, DOT has programs for that. And their current grant program is called RAISE. It used to be called BUILD or Tiger. So that's been around for a while. We got 17 more minutes, so it'll be lots of time for questions. And then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, of course, they are the main agency when you're dealing with floods. Their program now is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I just don't know if you can apply to their funds right now. I don't know if they're accepting applications, but they're as far as flood, sea level rise, and coastal management, they're the entity to reach out to. They have a number of programs. They do have a few grants, but they're mostly either matching grants or low interest loans. And they have several programs, so you do have to check in with them. And in California, our funding kind of mimics what the EPA Brownfields grants do, but in California too, we have carbon credits, and I don't know if it's still active, but there's still projects working off the carbon credits. We have the Strategic Growth Council and the Energy Commission do get funding for environmental justice grants and planning, both planning and implementation. And so the states do have their own funding, and I think Hawaii DBET has this kind of funding. So something to look at. And of course, states do have tax increment. My understanding is that Hawaii has the authorization but doesn't use it. California used to have tax increment. It was taken away, and they're replacing it with other kinds of tax increment financing tools. But again, this is something that can be used for infrastructure, and in this case, green infrastructure. Flood parks are very popular for this, and other smaller kinds of green infrastructure. But of course, in Hawaii, when you got the Pacific Ocean and lots of miles of water coastal areas, it's kind of daunting when you're thinking about you know a foot or so of sea level rise all around, and trying to mitigate that around the whole all of the islands. But that's really what you're looking at. You're going to have little solutions like green infrastructure to take care of the some kind of slowing down the floodwaters, but you're going to need some softening of your coastal areas. And in this is in the Bay Area, San Mateo, they taxed themselves. So San Mateo is a very affluent community, and they issued 90 million. I think they're going to raise because they're over budget, but they raised 90 million for essentially a levy to protect them from the rising tides of San Francisco Bay. Not very far from here is the city of East Palo Alto that is always subject to flooding. And I think there's a county program addressing generally the flooding in the area. But as you can see, San Mateo has the money to react very quickly. They applied for and I think might receive some U.S. Army Corps of Engineer funds, but they went ahead and taxed themselves because they have the money. A city like East Palo Alto, which is an environmental justice community, does not have that option. Even though Facebook offices are just around the corner, it's very difficult for them to go ahead and raise bonds themselves to protect their community. And again, that's where environmental justice comes in. And now, so what's making us do this, resilience? I mean, you are forward thinking in thinking about this, and many states are, but there really is no federal climate change law. These are all done through executive orders and appropriations. And there are international treaties, which, as you know, the United States has not been very. I don't know if you signed on, but it's as you know, we got off we didn't participate in some of these conferences, so that's kind of a work in progress. And so the climate change activities are really going on under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Superfund, which is CERCLA, and other EPA laws. So we're kind of nibbling at the corners here at climate change. The states do it, kind of enact these types of activities through the National Environmental Protection Act, or the state equivalent. In California, it's called CEQA, through planning and land use and zoning. And in California, it's also through the Health and Safety Code and the Government Code, where most cities are required to have sustainability plans and climate action plans. And in those plans, they develop policies, they develop goals and strategies, which become projects. So it takes a long time from a concept of climate action to have to become a coastal project to protect from sea level rise. And that's how you get funding, is you have to get a project. And so that's kind of the how other states, at least in California, adapt for climate change. And how does the private sector respond to these types of challenges? Well, again, looking at the literature, and I wouldn't even say literature. It's all the commentaries you see at the magazines is that the year 2100 is too far away. The tipping point, which you're saying, is to the 2 degrees Celsius, which is sorry about that. That tipping point is an intangible number. It's not it's not related to inflation. It's not related to investments, and they'd like to be told what to do, really. And the risk tolerance of the business community varies, depends on who you are, and their planning horizon is very different. There are opportunists, so some people who are risk averse will sell their assets, and those with risk tolerance will buy it. the private sector also has a lot of mitigation solutions. You'll see carbon capture and carbon sequestration and all these special highfalutin technologies. That's where the chemical industries are at, oil industries. That's where they are. They're continuing to produce carbon, emit carbon, and they're trying to mitigate their emissions. But there are businesses that are starting to do the ESG. So again, these are all in. There's an interplay here, and insurance. If you can't insure a project, then maybe they'll stop doing these projects. But we're not seeing insurance staying away from these types of projects. And of course, the business community will always influence regulation and policy, and they have lobbyists. Poor people don't have lobbyists. So that's another reason that why environmental justice, we have to look out for the poor and the people of color. And the markets will adapt, but again, the poor and those that are not well off will lose out. So here are a few, I would say, look at these. I referred to some of this. The city of Richmond there's a great YouTube of a meeting. A professor gave a presentation which illustrates a lot of these issues I mentioned, and some projects in the Bay Area addressing sea level rise and toxic sites. And for a couple of what other states are doing, Louisiana came out with Coastal Master Plan, and see what the Army Corps of Engineers is doing in the New York, New Jersey area. Those are two great sites to look over and see what's going on. So that concludes my presentation. We got some time for questions.
Thank you so much, both of you. Let's give them a hand, those of us that are not on mute. So let's open it up to questions. I know a few questions have been coming out on the chat, but those of you that would like to ask questions, go ahead and go off mute as you want to ask, and Alice will pepper in some of the questions that have been coming in on chat.
Yeah, maybe we can start with Janet's question. I'm not sure if it was already answered in the chat, but Janet asked, has EPA or anyone else mapped where these vulnerable communities are along with demographics?
And I put the link to EJ screen. I don't know what happened to my video, sorry. I put EJ screen links into the chat, so take a look at that. I also put the climate and economic justice screening tool that was developed in the last year. So you can take a look at where both the environmental justice, again, as researchers and as practitioners and students, think about what are the indices that are used in mapping, and would you use the same kinds of breakpoints for your data?
Yeah, and I think just a quick, I looked at EJ's screen not too long ago. Hilo definitely is a lot of, and these are in census tracts. The Hilo area would be one. Molokai would be another. There are some parts of, I think, the east side of Oahu. I mean outside on the east side of Honolulu, basically. There are some, and of course Chinatown. So there are areas within the islands that are within this, I would say, vulnerable communities.
And maybe you're the people that need to work on that mapping that's tailored and specific to Hawaii. And you can be thinking about the population risks, but you can also be thinking about what are the climate. There was a mention in the chat about really strategic retreat as the best only long-term solution, just because, with the uncertainty that Ignacio mentioned, how do you really thoughtfully and carefully plan? And how do you make sure that the people with the least resources are not, buried under that planning? So,
Yeah, so did anyone respond to Myla's question about modeling tools? So I'm not a hydrogeologist, but there are modeling tools. Actually, Chris, who's been commenting, is an environmental engineer, and you're free to chime in, Chris, if you're familiar with modeling tools. But again, there are many, and it really depends on the hydrogeology. Now, the hydrogeology, of course, of the islands is volcanic mostly, and it's very different from other. No, I actually don't know how it behaves, because in California it's very different, and so I don't know if you're familiar with how the hydrogeology of a volcanic uh, or islands with volcanic origin are, but I would think it would be very uh, groundwater would travel very quickly in
Right.
these situations.
Right. I mean, I'm not a geologist or a hydrogeologist, so I would be the wrong person to ask. But given what you're describing, and because there are not maybe the same kinds of mainland areas that would have comparable, situations, you almost would want to look at what do they have in New Zealand, what are they using in Indonesia, or in areas where there unfortunately has been a whole lot of natural resource extraction. So they would have had very good models, both of the environmental impact, but also, where it is they're doing exploration. That's my best guess. Sorry about that. USGS might have some ideas, and I would say that probably in the federal government, USGS and probably some of the EPA Superfund folks would be a good bet.
Any other questions? I have a question. So our team here at ISR, the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience, is working on a project to calculate the costs of sea level rise adaptation, of coastal adaptation. And thank you so much to both of you for highlighting some, resources that we can eventually tap into as we come up with our plans and strategies. Can you say anything else about the actual costs of doing one of these projects? I'm sure it has an awful lot to do with the kind of pollutants and the type of land and everything. But is our team is starting to look into what these kinds of strategies cost? I just wonder if you might comment on how to look at that from your perspective, and how we might go about calculating these sort of costs. I don't know if there's any great resources out there.
And when you ask about cost, is it a cost of cleaning up a site, a coastal brownfield?
I
for
think
instance?
both. I mean, obviously starting with that, and maybe you guys want to chime in, but obviously there's some cleanup, but also, if we were to relocate or turn it into a green space, or, do we retreat? Should we redevelop the land? Given these different options, obviously this is a very broad question, but, are there any good resources for calculating the costs of dealing with brownfield sites?
So there's good retrospective information. If you go to, I put a chat in earlier, if you just wanted to look at the mapping of contaminated sites, not only brownfields, but Superfund sites, RCRA sites, some federal facilities, as well as locations of emergency responses, you can actually either get a list or a map of those that have been reported to EPA. There's always a little bit of a lag, but it's probably one of the most complete listings that's available outside of going to individual states for their own additional inventories. California also has a fabulous one. So I would say we have good data about what cleanup has been at brownfield sites, because they're required to report it to EPA under their grants. And so that's a useful starter, but those are not the most contaminated sites. So you could do sort of, rough multipliers or actually then track other different, more complicated sites to find out what their costs are. So I think, looking at past cleanup data will probably give you a really good base elevation for your estimates. I think the harder part is how going forward, how much more expensive is cleanup going to be because of these changing environmental conditions? We've had stable environments for a while, and so we could project based on those stable environments. Now, when we have unstable environments, it's really difficult to project forward what those costs might be.
Yeah, and again, and I just saw a question from Chris about what EPA is using as a baseline. I think if you saw the DTSE chart, and actually it's in the early guidance, they're leaving that to the project manager, what their target would be. So even that, it's a moving target. But going also to the estimates, each site is different because contamination, depending on contamination, it will behave differently to rising rising sea level, and if it's saltwater intrusion as well. And so that could be, there probably is modeling for that again that you could find somewhere, and you could perhaps use an EPA grant to see what that looks like in one of the sites that your community has identified as a brownfield, to see what that might look like. I mean, you can even do that probably at Kaka'ako if that's something that to see how that might work. As an exercise, really, is what that might look like in Kaka'ako, because there's contamination remaining in place at Kaka'ako.
Thank you so much. I think unless there's any last questions, we should
I think there's just one
close.
more.
Okay.
Janet, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much for your presentations. I was wondering if there are points of contact that you can recommend in regard to, these EJ environmental justice,
Sure.
climate justice concerns, brownfields in particular for
Yeah,
AA and NHPI communities.
now there is a nonprofit that is actually gearing up for the EJ grants that are out now. It's called the Environmental Protection Network. So shoot me an email and I will get the contact for you. Those are for the EJ grants, which are different from the Brownfields grants.
So I did put the EJ grants in the chat, and so
Okay,
there should be a contact for that, for any kind of grant, because they have a collaborative problem solving one, they have small grants, they have them in different bins. You would want to actually figure out if you are looking at one grant or you want to seek all of them. They'll also be having webinars about the grants, because they actually have a significant amount of money that's going to be going out as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, really to highlight ways that there can be the multi-benefit resilience in EJ communities. So I think they're looking to get something out on the street this summer. As an EPA employee, I would send you to the San Francisco Region 9 office, and their EJ contact, but Ignacio has some more on the ground regional connections.
And the key to those grants is having a nonprofit partner, because these are specifically written for community-based organizations. There's a government-to-government grant, but the others are really more focused on not CBOs.
And thank you. Just to follow up for the webinars, um, are they going to be language interpreters, or is the information available in other languages besides English, like Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Tagalog, etc.?
I will have to, yeah, that would be on the EJ. Let me check now. Uh, they usually have some kind of, um,
And you can also request it. I think
yeah,
that would be a really important thing to request if there's particular languages that you want to see materials in. Then I would absolutely advocate for that and maybe work with other, organizations that would want to, make sure that they have information in the language that's appropriate for their cultural community.
Guys, so
Great,
much.
thank
We're
you.
actually over time now, and
Okay.
what I would just suggest is we can probably send out an email with follow-up information if you have it. But there's a lot of great posts in the chat, a lot of great resources. So I'd really like to thank our speakers today. Thank you so much, despite having some technical difficulties. I think we got a lot of wonderful information from you all. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us here at the ISR Spring Seminar Series. The next seminar will be held next Wednesday, same time, same place. And it will feature Dr. Shelley Habel, who's going to be presenting on sea level rise, flooding related impacts to the primary urban core in Honolulu. So it might be a good follow-up to this set of talks. She's really looking at that water inundation in our local area here. So thanks everyone, and please join us next week.
Thank you, and keep up your good work. We need lots of community interventions to make this, safe for all of us.